The Aztec liquid that could replace fertilizers, free and simple. Valley of Mexico, 1519. Hernan Cortez's soldiers advanced toward Tenochtitlan, and the first thing that stops them dead in their tracks is not an army, but a cultivated field. Corn taller than a man on horseback, peppers with fruits the size of an adult's fist, pumpkins so large that two people could not wrap their arms around them. The chroniclers traveling with the expedition wrote in their diaries that it seemed impossible, that the soil must be supernatural, and that some invisible force was feeding those plants from the inside. They did not understand what they were seeing because they had never seen truly living soil, and what the Mexicas poured around each stem, that dark, almost black liquid that smelled of fermented earth and concentrated life, never appeared in any European agricultural treatise, never made it into the books that shaped modern industrial agriculture. It disappeared, or more accurately, it was made to disappear. And what you are going to hear now is exactly how to prepare it yourself, for free, with what you already have at home. What you are about to hear is built upon verifiable historical records, codices available for consultation at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico, microbiological studies from the National Polytechnic Institute, and principles of lactic fermentation documented by contemporary science. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes based on interpretations of historical facts and good agricultural practices within the legal framework. It is not medical advice nor a promise of guaranteed results. It is knowledge that exists, that worked for centuries, and that anyone can safely investigate and replicate in their own space. If this kind of knowledge matters to you as much as it does to me, like this video right now. I am not asking for this gesture as a compliment. I am asking because when the algorithm sees that this has value, it brings it to more people who need it. And subscribe to the channel, because what we are going to unearth here together is just the beginning of everything the agro-industrial system would prefer you never knew. I am 56 years old and have had my hands in the dirt for over 3 decades. I have seen seeds germinate in conditions no one would believe possible, and I have seen soils die slowly from the same chemical dependency that was sold to us as progress. But before explaining how to prepare this liquid step by step, I need to tell you something that completely changed the way I understood agriculture. Something I learned alongside someone who is no longer here, and who, every time I smell wet earth after the rain, I feel is still here. His name was Miguel, a historian by training, a curious soul, and the man most passionate about the past of this soil I have ever met in my life. We met in Xochimilco almost 30 years ago, when I was a young agricultural technician, absolutely convinced that modern science had all the answers. Miguel arrived at a plot where I was advising a local producer on chemical fertilizers. He stood behind me, listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked with that quiet calm he had for everything, "Do you know what they did here 700 years ago?" And he pointed to the ground beneath our feet. We spent the following afternoon in his home library, surrounded by photocopies of codices and notebooks filled with cramped handwriting. Miguel showed me the illustrations. Mexica farmers pouring dark liquid from clay pots, plants with roots that filled entire pages, fruits drawn with a level of detail that only someone who had seen them up close could reproduce. And he explained to me, with that patience he had for everything, that what those farmers had developed was neither ritual nor superstition. It was empirical microbiology, centuries before the word microbiology existed in any language. It was the exact answer to the question that millions of people ask themselves today without knowing it. How do I feed my family if the system that supplies me fails? What the Mexicas prepared was called atocli. The term in Nahuatl literally translates to fertile water, water that makes things germinate. It was not a poetic name or a ceremonial metaphor. It was a functional and exact description of what that liquid did when it came into contact with the soil. And the best part, it was prepared with something you would throw in the trash today without a second thought. Broken corn kernels from the shelling process, the ones that are not suitable for human consumption or long-term storage, those kernels that nobody wants. Those were exactly the ones the Mexica farmers carefully separated before each planting cycle. They placed them in glazed clay pots with clean water and left them to ferment under the natural sun of the Central Highlands. What happened inside those pots over the following days was not mysterious at all. It was pure biochemistry in an active state. The cornstarch hydrolyzed into simple sugars through the action of natural enzymes. Lactic acid bacteria of the Lactobacillus genus colonized the medium at an exponential rate. Wild yeasts of the Saccharomyces genus initiated reproduction cycles that, in 72 hours, generated concentrations of up to 10 million colony-forming units per milliliter of active liquid. To put that number into perspective, there are more living microorganisms in a single drop of ferment than there are people in all of present-day Mexico City. But the quantity is not the most important thing. What those microorganisms produce as a metabolic byproduct while they reproduce is what changes everything. During active lactic fermentation, the yeasts secrete natural auxins. Auxins are phytohormones, signaling molecules that directly regulate cell division in plant tissues. When a root detects high concentrations of auxins in the surrounding soil, the plant's hormonal system interprets that signal as a direct instruction: grow, expand, absorb, multiply. Atocli did not just provide dissolved nutrients to the soil, it delivered the biochemical instructions that activated growth from within the plant itself. Without a laboratory, without industrial processes, without buying anything every season. And before continuing with the exact procedure, something important. This process is completely safe to prepare and apply. Corn ferment undergoing lactic fermentation does not generate toxic compounds when prepared correctly in a ventilated space. The bacteria it produces are the same ones present in yogurt and in the food ferments that human beings have consumed for millennia. It poses no risk of contact or inhalation under normal conditions. The only sign for disposal is simple and clear. If the smell goes from naturally sour to downright putrid, that batch is discarded. The process tells you itself, without the need for any laboratory analysis. In 1943, the agronomist Efrain Hernandez Xolocotzi documented for the first time in modern scientific terms the persistent use of these ferments in the Chinampa communities of Xochimilco that still maintain traditional practices. His field notebooks described in detail how third and fourth generation farmers applied the liquid exactly every 14 days throughout the entire vegetative period. The comparative measurements he conducted showed yield increases of 180% in local varieties of serrano peppers and 220% in heirloom tomatoes, compared to control plots with no treatment. Hernandez Xolocotzi tried to publish those findings in international agricultural journals. They all rejected the manuscript. The official justification cited traditional methods without validation through replicable controlled trials. But by 1943, the Green Revolution had already begun its aggressive expansion, and the model was absolutely clear. Improved seeds plus synthetic nitrogen fertilizers equaled perpetual technological dependency. A farmer who produces their own biological input with discarded corn does not represent a recurring customer, and that had no place in the system that was being built. The proportion that the Mexica memorized for generations was not approximate, it was exact. And that exactness is the reason why the method worked consistently in the hands of different farmers, in different plots, for over 200 years without variation. 1 kiln of dry, cracked corn kernels for exactly every 10 L of clean water. That is the base formula, deceptively simple, absolutely critical in every one of its details. The corn must be mechanically cracked or ground to a coarse texture, never reduced to a fine flour. Whole, uncracked kernels release their starches too slowly, and fermentation stalls before reaching the optimal point. Very fine flour, on the other hand, forms a gelatinous paste that prevents the circulation of dissolved oxygen and favors undesirable anaerobic fermentation, which produces foul-smelling volatile compounds instead of the clean lactic acid you need. The correct point is the texture of cracked corn for pozole or chicha, fragments broken into 3 or 4 visible pieces, with the germ exposed but not pulverized. The container matters more than it seems. Traditional glazed clay, thick glass, or certified food-grade plastic. Never metal of any kind, without exception. Metal reacts chemically with the organic acids produced during fermentation and contaminates the ferment with metal ions that inhibit bacterial colonies just as they are reaching their point of highest population density. It is the most common mistake among those who attempt this process for the first time and do not understand why their ferment never develops the correct consistency. Now comes the detail that almost no manual mentions, and that destroys more ferments than any other factor: the water. If you use municipal tap water, that water contains residual chlorine. The chlorine is there for a legitimate purpose: to eliminate pathogenic microorganisms in the pipes. The problem is that it does not discriminate. When you pour chlorinated water directly over the cracked corn, the chlorine selectively eliminates the beneficial lactic acid bacteria before they can establish viable colonies. Your ferment seems active for the first few days, and then stops or becomes contaminated with undesirable microorganisms that do tolerate chlorine. The solution is so simple, it seems absurd. Pour the water into an open container and let it sit for 24 hours before using it. Chlorine is a dissolved gas. At room temperature and with an exposed surface, it evaporates completely in that time. No filters, no treatments, no additional cost, just time. Directly collected rainwater also works optimally and was precisely what the Mexica used in the Chinampas of Lake Texcoco. Water without chemical treatment of any kind. With the correct water and the cracked corn inside the appropriate container, stir vigorously to ensure that all fragments are completely submerged. Cover the container with a thin woven cloth, cheesecloth, or gauze, which allows for constant gas exchange but blocks access to insects. Place it in a location with indirect ambient heat, never direct sun exposure that raises the temperature above 35 and kills the microorganisms, but also not in permanent cold shade below 20 degrees that stops metabolic activity. The optimal range is between 25 and 32 degrees. The natural conditions of most homes in temperate and warm climates of Latin America during the peak growing months. What happens inside the container during the first 5 days is a precise biological sequence that you can observe, smell, and measure with your own senses without any special equipment. The first 24 hours are deceptively quiet. A few microscopic bubbles on the surface, nothing more. But beneath the visible lactic acid bacteria are already colonizing the medium, consuming the sugars released by the hydrolyzation of the starch, and beginning to acidify the environment. On the second day, the liquid becomes uniformly opaque. The smell changes from neutral to slightly sour, comparable to the aroma of freshly made plain yogurt. That olfactory transformation is your first sign of confirmation. The lactic colonies are active and producing. On the third day, a layer of whitish foam appears floating on the surface. That is the moment that scares many and makes them think something went wrong. It is exactly the opposite. That foam is yeast activity, millions of Saccharomyces cells metabolizing sugars and releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. The smell intensifies, definitely sour, but never putrid or unpleasant. If the smell crosses into something you would describe as rotten or rancid, that batch is discarded without further ado. Between the fourth and fifth day, the liquid reaches its optimal point of maturation. The color has turned dark brown, almost black in opaque containers. The consistency becomes slightly viscous, with mucilaginous threads visible when stirring. The pH should be between 3.5 and 4.0, measurable with universal indicator paper strips. Within that range, pathogens cannot survive, but beneficial yeasts thrive without competition. If the pH is there, you hold in your hands the exact same biologically active ferment that sustained the agricultural production of Tenochtitlan for over 2 centuries. Here comes the step that absolutely no one mentions, and that makes the difference between activating growth or burning the roots. The mature ferment is never applied in a pure, concentrated state, never. The Mexica obligatorily diluted it, following a second proportion as precise as the first. 1 L of mature ferment for every 10 L of new clean water, a 1.10 volumetric dilution. Without that dilution, the extremely high concentration of organic acids can cause chemical burns on young roots and tender tissues, exactly the opposite effect of what you are looking for. Friar Toribio de Benavente, historically known as Motolinia, described it in his work History of the Indians of New Spain, completed in 1541. Mexica farmers tempered the dark liquid with clean water in a measure of 1 to 10 parts before watering, and in that way, the plants received benefit instead of harm. a 16th century ethnographic observation that coincides exactly with what modern agricultural microbiology recommends today as the best practice for applying concentrated bioinoculants. Apply the correctly diluted ferment directly onto the bare soil around the perimeter of each stem, never on the foliage or leaves. The roots will detect the dissolved chemical signals in a matter of hours through specialized chemoreceptors in their root apices. You do not need to incorporate it by mixing it with the soil. Pour it as a liquid tonic around each plant and let the soil absorb it naturally. The visible response takes between 3 and 5 days depending on the species. The main stem becomes noticeably firmer and more erect. The lower leaves that showed chlorotic yellowing begin to recover a normal green coloration. Then new adventitious roots appear. If you carefully lift a superficial layer of moist soil near the crown of the plant without damaging existing structures, you will be able to observe masses of fine, hair-like white rootlets sprouting radially in all directions. That white root proliferation is an unequivocal sign of active and vigorous growth. In plants of the Solanaceae family, such as tomatoes or chili peppers, the effect is particularly dramatic. The stem internodes shorten visibly. The plant's architecture becomes more compact, but its foliar density increases. The inflorescences appear in significantly denser clusters. The fruits reach larger final sizes, around 30% larger compared to the standard averages for the variety. Historical records from Xochimilco indicate that Chinampero producers applied the diluted ferment exactly every 14 days throughout the entire vegetative cycle. It was not a single or sporadic application. Constant periodicity was an essential component of the method. After 3 or 4 consecutive applications, the soil itself begins to transform. A spongier texture, greater water retention, that characteristic smell of fertile, biologically active soil, intensifying with each cycle. Now I need you to understand something that goes beyond the technique, because you already have the technique. What is missing is understanding why this is not in any official manual, and why the information you just heard was replaced in less than 2 decades by a completely different model. In 1960, Mexico imported 0 tons of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. By 1980, barely 20 years later, annual imports reached 2.3 million metric tons. That change was not a gradual transition or a voluntary adoption. It was an accelerated transformation through concrete financial engineering. Government agricultural credits conditioned on the exclusive use of certified modern inputs. Federal subsidies that only applied if the producer bought hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers from approved brands. Traditional ferments were left completely out of the official support system, not because they were agronomically ineffective, but because they did not generate trackable commercial transactions. A farmer who produces their own biological input with discarded corn does not pay VAT on that production. They do not sustain distribution chains. They do not feed the business model that sustains the globalized agribusiness. Reduce the contrast to concrete numbers and the picture becomes brutally clear. A 50-kilo bag of NPK chemical fertilizer costs approximately 850 Mexican pesos at current prices. It yields enough for half a hectare for one season. A small producer with 2 arable hectares spends around 1,300 pesos a year exclusively on fertilizer, not counting seeds or pesticides. The traditional corn ferment requires 2 kilograms of discarded grain, which at any mill costs less than 50 pesos. That amount produces 20 L of active concentrate, which properly diluted yields 200 L of applicable solution. This is enough volume to keep 1 hectare covered for 2 weeks. Projected annual cost for the full 2 hectares, less than 600 pesos in total. The difference between 13,600 and 600 is 13,000 pesos in net savings per producer per year. Now you understand exactly why this knowledge takes up no space in official agricultural information channels. And this is where I want to speak to you directly because this goes beyond the numbers. If the market fails tomorrow, if prices suddenly spike or the supply is cut off, the person who knows how to prepare this in their backyard has something no supermarket can sell them: real autonomy over what their family eats. That is exactly the knowledge I gathered, a practical manual with this method and many others like it, designed for those who don't have hectares or a laboratory, but rather a small space and the will not to depend on what comes from the outside. It is not theory. It is what I apply myself. The link is in the description of this video. If what you have heard so far has already changed your perspective, what is inside the manual is going to change the way you produce. There is one afternoon that I will never forget. We were at Miguel's house. We had spent hours reviewing Hernandez Solocotzi's notebooks, the codices, Modellinia's letters, and the microbiological analyses from the EPN. We had arrived together at exactly what you just heard, that the autocly was not a cultural tradition in the folkloric sense. It was functional biological technology displaced by economic decisions that had nothing to do with science. Miguel had suspected it for years. That afternoon, we had put it all together, every piece in its place. When I got up to leave, he hugged me at the door of his house. It was a long hug, the kind you give when you feel that something important has just ended or has just begun. He whispered in my ear with that calm voice he always had. Now that you know, don't keep it to yourself. The earth needs people to tell these things. I never saw him again. He passed away weeks later, suddenly, without either of us knowing that that afternoon in his library was going to be the last. Every time I prepare a ferment, I think of that hug. I think of him looking at the codices in the afternoon light coming through his study window. And I think of you, who have been looking for exactly this for a long time. A way to produce real food with what you have, without depending on what the market decides to sell you every season. Miguel told me not to keep it to myself. I didn't keep it. What the Spanish chroniclers could not explain in 1519 was not magic or supernatural soil. It was a closed loop that industrial agriculture could never replicate because it was never in its best interest to try. The Mexicas did not just use the ferment as an external input. They recycled absolutely all post-harvest plant material back into the system. After each harvest, the dry stalks, senescent leaves, and empty corncob structures went straight back into the active fermentation water. The ferment fed the plant, upon finishing its cycle, fed the next ferment. A system that sustained itself indefinitely without the need to buy anything from the outside. That is what produced 7 full harvests a year in the same soil without degradation. It wasn't supernatural earth. It was the closed loop functioning without interruptions. That is the detail the industrial model cannot offer you, because it destroys its reason for existing. A self-sustaining cycle does not generate customers. A soil that improves with each harvest does not need to be corrected with new bags every season. And a farmer who understands this no longer depends on the price someone else decides to put on their next harvest. Today you have everything you need to start. 1 kilogram of cracked corn, 10 liters of rested water, a glass or clay container, 5 days of patience, and the knowledge you have just received. The same knowledge that sustained an entire civilization for over 2 centuries, and that disappeared not because it stopped working, but because working forever is not a profitable business model. If you want to take this further, if you want to apply this method and others like it in your space, whether it's a small backyard, an urban garden, or a larger plot of land, the manual is available in the description of this video. There you will find this complete procedure with every proportion, every visual cue, and every detail of the recycling cycle the Mexicas used, along with other documented ancestral agricultural techniques that the agro-industrial system prefers to keep out of circulation. Not because they don't work, but precisely because they do work. The link is below. It is the next step for those who decide to stop depending. And if you made it this far, I ask you for something concrete. Subscribe to the channel right now. Not as an automatic gesture, but because what we build here week by week is exactly this type of knowledge. Verifiable, replicable, free in its essence, and deliberately ignored by official channels. Every subscriber helps this content reach more people who need it before they need it urgently. Like this video if anything you heard today changed the way you see the soil beneath your feet, and leave me your comment below. Did you already know about autocly? Are you going to prepare it? Do you have any ancestral technique from your region that you think deserves to be unearthed? I read every comment, always. Before I say goodbye, I want you to take away a single image from everything we saw today. Not the formula, not the numbers, not the IPN data, the image of a Mexica farmer in 1325, standing in front of a chinampa with a clay pot in his hands, calmly pouring a dark liquid around a cornstalk with no labels, no barcodes, no invoice, just knowledge accumulated over generations, transmitted in silence from hand to hand, and buried in less than 20 years by an economic model that needed you to forget that this knowledge existed. Miguel told me not to keep it to myself. I am handing it over to you. What you do with it is up to you. If this story has changed the way you see the earth and the secrets it hides, subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury so you can sow your own future. The next treasure of ancestral knowledge will be opened soon. Don't miss it.